Hand me the rifle, soldier, just for the photograph. One picture and I'll give it right back. I was standing 8 feet to the left of the man who heard those words, and I watched him not move, and I knew before the rest of the room did that the evening had just changed. I am the officer of his guard. My name does not matter to this story. His stillness does. The man asking was the most powerful guest at the Founders' Eve reception, and he had reached the age and the altitude where no one had told him no in a very long time. He was about to learn that the line he had crossed was older than his money, and that it did not bend. Let me set the floor before the rest of it lands, because the shape of the room is the shape of what went wrong. The hall of the long table sits on the river side of Calder House, our household seat, and on Founders' Eve it is opened once a year to the men and women the realm needs to keep close, financiers, builders of bridges, the heads of houses that lend the crown money when the crown is short. Gilt runs the length of the cornice. 3 crystal trees of light hang down the center on chains as thick as my wrist. The floor is a checker of black and white marble worn into shallow bowls by 200 years of feet, and at intervals along the river wall stand the men of the Calder Guard, bearskin, scarlet wool, white gloves, the rifle at the order, the bayonet seated, eyes 1,000 yards forward through the chandeliers. They are not decoration. People forget that. The rifle is not a prop, the bayonet is not a costume buckle, and the man behind the chin strap is not a wax figure they wheeled in for color. But on a night like that, with the champagne moving and the orchestra low, it is the easiest thing in the world to forget. The guardsman at the 3rd pillar was a man I will call Sergeant Aldous Varon, because I will not give you his right name and let some idle person go looking for him. He had stood that pillar for 6 years. He had a wife who cut hair 2 streets from the barracks, 2 boys who thought his bearskin was the funniest thing in the world, and a record so clean you could have eaten off it. He had also, before any of that, done 11 years of soldiering that does not get written on the brass plaques, and I knew it because I had read his file the way an officer reads the files of the men whose lives he is responsible for. He was the steadiest man on that wall. That is precisely why he was at the 3rd pillar, the one nearest the receiving end of the hall, where the important guests gathered and the trouble, if it came, would come. It came in a gray suit that cost more than the sergeant earned in a year, on a man I will call the magnate. That is enough of a name for him. He had built things. Ports mostly, and the companies that own ports, and the companies that own those companies. He had flown in that afternoon on an aircraft with his own crest painted on the tail, and he had spent the first hour of the reception being orbited by people who wanted him to remember their faces. By the 2nd hour the orbit had thinned, the way orbits do when a man drinks faster than he listens, and the magnate had begun to look around the room for something that would put the attention back on him. He found the wall of scarlet. I saw him drift toward the 3rd pillar with 2 of his own people trailing, a younger man with a tablet who I took for an aide, and a woman in a dark suit with an earpiece who I took, correctly, for his security. I had been an officer long enough to read a guest's intentions from the way he aims his shoulders, and the magnate's shoulders were aimed at Sergeant Varon like a man lining up a trophy. I began, without hurry, to close the distance. You do not run on that floor. You do not raise your voice. You move like the thing you are afraid of has not happened yet, because the moment you look afraid of it, you have invited it. The magnate stopped a pace in front of the sergeant, and looked him up and down the way you'd appraise a horse. "Marvelous," he said, loud enough for the cluster of guests behind him. "Absolutely marvelous. They make you stand like that all night." Varon did not answer. They are not permitted to, and even if they were, Varon would not have. His eyes stayed forward. His chest rose and fell so slowly, you would have had to watch for a minute to see it move at all. "He won't even blink," the magnate told his audience, delighted. He waved a hand in front of the bearskin. He snapped his fingers. He leaned in close enough that I saw Varon's jaw tighten by a fraction no civilian in that room could have measured, and then ease again, the way a man eases a fist he has decided not to throw. Extraordinary, like talking to a statue. A few people laughed. Most did not. The ones who knew the household well had gone quiet, the particular quiet of people who can feel weather coming. Then the magnate had his idea, and I watched it arrive on his face like sunrise on a bad coast. "Picture," he announced. "I want a picture. Me and the toy soldier." He half-turned to the aide. "Get the camera." Then to Varen, in the tone of a man ordering a second bottle, he said the thing that began all of it. "Hand me the rifle, soldier, just for the photograph. One picture and I'll give it right back." I was 4 steps away, close enough now to see the whole of it. Varen did not move. Not his eyes, not his hands, not the rifle, which stayed seated against his right side as it had been seated since he marched on at 7 that evening. He gave the magnate nothing, no glance, no shake of the head, not the smallest acknowledgement that a sound had even been made in his direction. To the room it looked like the statue had simply gone on being a statue. To me, it looked like a man refusing an order without spending a single word to do it, and doing it so cleanly that the refusal had no edge for the other man to grab. The magnate's smile thinned. He was not used to a closed door. You could see it cost him something to understand that the door was closed, that this was not a delay, not a man working up his nerve to obey, but a flat, total, courteous no delivered without a syllable. And men like the magnate, when they meet a no, do not retreat. They lean. "I don't think you heard me," he said, and the delight was gone out of his voice now, replaced by the cool edge of someone reaching for the lever he is sure will work. "I asked for the rifle. Do you have any idea who I am? I have dined with your prince. I have lent this house more money than your barracks will see in 50 years. One photograph. Give it here." And he put out his hand, palm up, and took the last half step that closed the polite distance between a guest and a guardsman, close enough that his outstretched fingers were a foot from the rifle's fore end. That was the moment the room understood. The cluster behind him drew back. Somewhere a glass was set down on marble with a small hard sound. The orchestra, which had been drifting through something gentle, seemed to thin to a single instrument and then to nothing, though I could not have told you when the music stopped. And I, who had spent the last 30 seconds covering ground without seeming to move at all, arrived at the sergeant's left shoulder and stopped, and let the magnate see the silver on my collar, and waited 1 heartbeat to give him the chance to be wise. He did not take it. "You," he said to me, the way he'd say it to a head waiter who'd come to fuss, "tell your man to hand it over. It's a photograph. It's a bit of fun, tell him." "Sir," I said, and I kept my voice low and even, the voice you use when you want a man to lower his own without realizing he's been led there. "The sergeant's weapon does not leave his hands. Not for a photograph. Not for any guest. It's not a discourtesy to you. It's the rule he stands here to keep." "Rules," the magnate said, and almost laughed, except that the laugh did not have anywhere good to go. "I've bought and sold men who quote me rules. Do you know what I think? I think you've been standing in that pretty coat so long you've forgotten who actually runs anything in this country." He turned back to Varen, dismissing me. "Last chance, soldier. The rifle, now." And he reached for it. I had been a soldier for a long time before I was an officer, and I have learned that the most dangerous instant in any confrontation is not the shout or the shove. It is the small, casual reach. The hand that moves before the brain has finished deciding, because the man has never once in his life had a reach refused. The magnate's hand came out, fast and certain, and closed the last foot toward the fore end of a loaded ceremonial rifle, held by a man whose entire training, whose entire being, was built around the single immovable truth that this weapon does not leave him. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, and I will tell it slowly so you understand that not one part of it was violence. Varen moved. After all that stillness, the suddenness of it was its own kind of thunder. But he did not strike, he did not shove, he did not so much as raise his voice. He brought the rifle up and across, one short, brutally precise motion of drill, the same motion that begins a present arms, except that he stopped it dead at the point where the rifle lay across his own body like a bar of iron, the forend now seated in his white-gloved left hand, the whole weapon angled between himself and the reaching man like a closed gate. The magnate's fingers met the wood of a stock that had simply ceased to be where he expected it, and the rifle did not give a hair, because behind it stood 190 pounds of man who had braced through the soles of his boots into 200 years of marble. The magnate's hand bounced off it. He stumbled back half a step, more from surprise than from force, and stood there with his palms stinging and his mouth open, looking at a guardsman who was once again perfectly still but no longer at the order. Now the sergeant held the rifle high across his chest, barrel up, the bayonet catching the light of the crystal trees, his eyes for the first time all night not forward but locked dead onto the magnate's. It was not a threat. There was no menace in it. It was the look of a man who has shut a door and is now simply, patiently, watching to see whether you will be foolish enough to try the handle again. "Did you see that?" the magnate said, and his voice had climbed. He spun to his audience, to his security, to me. "He assaulted me. You all saw it. He raised a weapon at me. He pointed a shaking finger at the bayonet. I will have his job. I will have this whole circus shut down by morning. Do you understand what I can do?" I stepped between them, not to protect the magnate, who was in no danger, but to give the sergeant the half-second he would need to come down off the present arms and back to the order without it looking like a retreat. And as I did, I caught the eye of the woman in the dark suit, the magnate's own security, and I saw something there that the magnate could not see because he had his back to her. She had watched the whole thing. She knew exactly what had and had not happened. And she gave me the smallest shake of her head, not at me, at him. That is when I understood that this was not going to end the way the magnate thought it would. He believed he had been assaulted, and that the machinery of his money was about to come down on us like a tide. What he did not yet understand, what would take the rest of that long, extraordinary night to make plain to him, was that he had reached for the one thing in that hall that the entire weight of the household, the chain of command, and 2 centuries of an institution would close ranks to protect. He thought he had insulted a man. He had reached for the weapon they all stood for. The first man to reach us was not one of mine. He came through the crowd from the direction of the receiving end, a tall, older man in a plain, dark coat with a single small enamel pin at his lapel, and he moved through that press of guests the way a keel moves through water. Nothing parted for him visibly, and yet everything parted. I knew him. Most of the room did not, which was rather the point of him. He was the controller of the house, the man who runs Calder House the way a quartermaster runs a fortress, who answers to one person only and whom the rest of us answer to in turn. He had been somewhere along the far wall when it happened, and he had crossed 40 feet of marble before I had finished stepping between the 2 men. "Officer," he said to me quietly, not a question. He stood beside me and looked at the scene the way you'd look at a board mid-game, the magnate red-faced and pointing, the sergeant high at the present arms, the 2 pieces of the magnate's retinue, the cluster of guests fanned back into a half-circle of held breath. He took perhaps 3 seconds. Then he turned to the magnate and did the most disarming thing a man in his position could have done. He bowed, a short, formal, scrupulously correct bow, the bow of a host to an honored guest. "Sir," the controller said, "you are a guest of this house, and you have my apology that your evening has been disturbed." The magnate, who had been winding himself up to shout, found the ground taken out from under him. You could see him recalibrate. An apology, good. An apology was a confession. An apology meant they knew they were in the wrong, and a man who knows he is in the wrong can be pushed. "Disturbed," the magnate repeated, seizing it. "Disturbed is a small word for it. Your man raised a weapon at me, in front of 50 witnesses. I want him removed from this building, I want his name, and I want it understood that there will be consequences for this house that you have not begun to imagine." I'm sure, the controller said, with a courtesy so smooth it left no handhold, that you'll want the matter understood completely before any of that. So let me make certain I have it right. And he turned, unhurried, to the gathered guests, the financiers, the bridge builders, the heads of houses, and raised his voice just enough to carry. Did anyone here see the sergeant strike this gentleman, shove him, touch him at all? Silence, the kind that answers. Did anyone see the sergeant move? The controller went on, before this gentleman put his hand on the sergeant's rifle. And now a thing happened that the magnate had not budgeted for. From the half-circle, a voice, a woman, a banker by her bearing, who I later learned ran one of the larger lending houses and feared the magnate not at all. He reached for the gun first, she said clearly. We all watched it. The soldier never touched him. He just closed it off like a gate. A man beside her nodded. Then another. The room which the magnate had assumed was his was quietly and unanimously not. The controller let that settle for exactly one beat. Then he turned back to the magnate, and his voice dropped to the register that does not carry past the people it is meant for, and the courtesy in it had gone from warm to cold without changing a single word in temperature. So, to be precise, sir, since precision matters to men of business, you ordered a serving guardsman to surrender his service weapon. He declined, as he is sworn and required to do. You then attempted to take that weapon from his hands. He prevented you without laying a finger on you by the cleanest piece of drill I have seen in 30 years in this house. That is the matter complete. Now, you spoke of consequences. I should like to make certain you understand whose. It was beautifully done. I have served under hard men and clever men, and I have rarely seen a thing dismantled so gently. But I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that moment, standing there in my dress uniform with my heart going like a drum, because the playbook says the officer is calm and the playbook is half a lie. I was furious. Not loudly, a guardsman who lets his fury show is no better than the man who provoked it. But underneath, in the place where an officer keeps the things he will never say, I was as angry as I have ever been on duty. Because the magnate had reached for Varen's rifle the way you'd reach for a salt cellar, and in doing that he had said with his whole body that the man behind it was furniture, that his oath was a costume. That 6 years on a marble floor and 11 before that in places with no marble at all amounted to a photo opportunity. And the worst of it, the part that kept my own jaw tight, was that the magnate genuinely did not know he had done anything wrong. He thought he was the wronged party. He stood there nursing his stung palm, certain that the universe was about to arrange itself to punish the toy soldier who had embarrassed him. He did not yet know that the universe, in that hall, wore scarlet. Whose consequences, the magnate said, recovering, sneering it back. You'll want to be very careful, little man. I could pull my houses out of this realm's paper by Monday. I could make a phone call that would cost your crown more than your whole regiment is worth. You're threatening me with consequences over a soldier. I am not threatening you with anything, the controller said. I am informing you. There is a difference, and it is the difference between us. He let that hang. But you've named the cost of your goodwill, and that is your right. So permit me to name the cost of your hand on that rifle. Then you may weigh them against each other like the businessman you are and decide. And here is where I expected the night to turn into a quiet, ugly negotiation, money against pride. A thing smoothed over with a private word and a discreet exit, the way these things usually go, the way the powerful are usually allowed to walk backward out of their own mistakes with their dignity intact. I have seen it 100 times. The house does not, as a rule, go to war with men who lend it money over a moment of bad manners. I was wrong about the night. Because at that exact moment, a side door at the head of the hall opened, the door that does not, on ordinary evenings, open at all. And the room, all of it, the financiers and the bankers and the magnate and his security and my whole wall of scarlet, came to its feet and turned and went silent in a single rustle of cloth, because the only person for whom that door opens had just walked through it. I will not describe the figure beyond saying this. The head of our fictional house, the one our guardsmen swear to, the one whose service the rifle exists to protect, had been somewhere in the private rooms above, and word travels fast in a house full of people whose whole purpose is to watch and to carry it. Someone had carried it. And now the one person in the realm whom the magnate could not buy, could not threaten, and could not orbit was standing 30 feet away, looking down the length of the hall of the long table at a guest who had just put his hand on a guardsman's rifle. The magnate, to his credit, knew enough to bow. Everyone bowed. The bow ran down the hall like wind through wheat. I bowed, and out of the corner of my eye I saw Sergeant Varon come down off the present arms. Not because anyone had ordered it, but because the protocol of that arrival required it, and bring the rifle back to the order with a snap that was the loudest sound the hall had made in 5 minutes, and stand at attention, eyes once again 1,000 yards forward, as though the last 10 minutes had been a dream the rest of us had had and he had not been part of it all. The head of the house did not raise a voice, did not need to, crossed perhaps half the distance and stopped, and the controller went smoothly to that side and murmured something brief, the complete and unflattering truth, I had no doubt, because the controller did not deal in any other currency. And then a question was asked. I was close enough to hear it, and I have carried it ever since. Is my guardsman well? Not what happened, not who is at fault, not how do we make this quiet. The first question, the only first question, was whether the man on the wall was well. I felt something in my chest that I will not try to name, except to say that it is the reason men like Varon and men like me give our lives to a thing that pays badly and asks everything. Because the question told the whole hall, in 4 words, exactly where the house stood. It stood with the wall. He is, sir, the controller said. He conducted himself perfectly. The disturbance was entirely from the other quarter. A pause. Then the head of the house looked for the first time directly at the magnate, and I watched a man who owned ports discover in real time that there exists a kind of authority that ports cannot buy. The magnate's mouth was already moving, already assembling the grievance, the threats, the houses he would pull and the calls he would make. But before he could launch it, the thing he most needed to understand was made plain to him, not with anger, but with a calm so total it was its own kind of force. That rifle, the head of the house said, quietly to the magnate, is not a curiosity. The man who holds it has sworn to keep it in his hands though it cost him his life, and tonight he kept his oath against a guest who would have made him break it for a photograph. You are welcome in this house. The weapon is not yours to hold. There is no sum that changes that, and there is no friendship that changes it. And I will tell you plainly that I would rather have one sergeant who will not surrender his rifle than every port you own. I have replayed those words many times. What strikes me most is that there was no threat in them. The head of the house did not say, I will ruin you, did not say, leave my hall, did not so much as raise the temperature of the room. And yet the magnate went pale, because a threat he could have fought. A man who threatens you has admitted that you are a problem he must solve. And the magnate's whole genius was for solving problems with money. But there was no problem here for money to solve. There was only a quiet statement of where a line lay, delivered by the one person whose lines did not move. And the magnate stood in the wreck of his own assumption, and understood, perhaps for the first time in decades, that he had walked into a place where he was not the largest thing in the room. He should have bowed again and left. A wiser man would have. But pride, when it is wounded in front of 50 people it considers beneath it, does not get wiser. It gets louder. This is absurd, the magnate said, and his voice cracked up out of the careful register the room had been keeping. All of this theater, over a rifle that fires blanks at tourists. You stand here and lecture me about oaths. I built half the harbors this realm ships through. I keep your lights on. And you choose a hat and a coat over me. He jabbed a finger at Varon, who did not so much as flicker. He is a doorman with a fur cap. I will be on the telephone tonight, and by the time your river fog burns off tomorrow, every line of credit this house leans on will have a question mark beside it. Let us see how your sergeant's oath looks then. It was the wrong thing to say, and it was the wrong room to say it in, and I watched it become wrong in real time on the faces all around him. Because the financiers and the bridge builders and the heads of houses were not the magnates. They were the realms. And a man does not threaten to pull the lights on a country in front of 50 of its richest citizens and walk away looking like the strong one. He walks away looking like exactly what he is, a man who, denied a toy, threatens to burn the house down. The head of the house said nothing further. There was no need. The matter had been spoken to, and a thing once spoken to by that voice does not get re-argued. With a small inclination of the head to the room, not to the magnate. To the room, the figure turned and went back through the side door it had come from, and the door closed, and the air came back into the hall all at once. The controller exhaled through his nose, the closest thing to emotion I ever saw him permit himself, and turned to me. "Officer," he said, "see the sergeant relieved and rested, quietly. He's done nothing wrong, and I won't have him standing that pillar another hour as though he's being punished. Bring a man up to take the post." "Sir," I said. "And the gentleman," the controller added, with a glance at the magnate that had gone entirely without warmth, "will of course be escorted to his car whenever he wishes to leave, with every courtesy." The last 3 words landed like the closing of a ledger. That should have been the end of it. In a just and tidy world, the magnate would have taken his stung pride and his expensive coat and his crested aircraft and gone home, and the worst of the night would have been a story the bankers told for a month. But the magnate was not finished, and the reason he was not finished is the reason this story is worth telling. Because he did the thing that powerful men do when they have lost a room. He went outside the room. He went to find a bigger lever. He pulled out his telephone there in the middle of the hall, and he made his call. I want to be careful here, because what happened over the next 2 hours was not magic and it was not luck, and the playbook is right to forbid me to lean on either. It was the slow, certain working out of what an institution actually is, which most people never get to see, because most people never reach for the thing it exists to protect. Let me tell it plainly. The magnate's call was to a man he kept on retainer. Not a lawyer exactly, though there were lawyers downstream of him. More of a fixer, the kind of figure a great fortune accretes the way a hull accretes barnacles. A man whose job is to make the powerful man's wishes into other people's problems. I learned the shape of all this afterward, in the days when the dust settled and the accounts were taken. That night I knew only what I saw. The magnate, by the cold marble of the river wall, talking fast and low into his phone, the color coming back into his face as he talked, because giving an order is the thing that makes a man like him feel real again. He was, I gathered, instructing his people to begin the demolition. A statement to the morning papers about the assault he had suffered at the hands of the KingsGuard. A quiet word to 2 ministers he had dined with. A pause placed on a tranche of the house's financing that was due to roll the following week. By the time the sun was up, the magnate intended, the story would be that a brutish guardsman had attacked a beloved benefactor, and a house too arrogant to apologize had backed the brute, and the only question would be how much it would cost us to make it go away. He hung up looking enormously pleased with himself, and he caught my eye across the hall, and he smiled the smile of a man who has just remembered how the world really works. I did not smile back. I did not need to, because while the magnate had been making his 1 call, the house had been making its 100. This is the part the powerful never see, because they are always the ones reaching, never the ones reached for. The instant the head of the house had asked, "Is my guardsman well?" a different machine had begun, quietly, to turn. The controller had not gone back to his canapes. He had stepped to a doorway and spoken 3 sentences to an understeward, who had spoken to a clerk, who had a telephone of his own. The woman in the dark suit, the magnate's own security, had on her way past me to fetch the car, paused long enough to say, very quietly and entirely off the record, "For what it's worth, sir, I've worked for that man for 9 years and the soldier was perfect. I'll say so if I'm ever asked. She would be asked. And the 50 witnesses in that hall, the bankers and the builders, were not, it turned out, going home to keep a polite silence. They were going home having watched a guardsman keep his oath with a piece of clean drill, and a host's house stand behind him without flinching. And that, in a realm that runs on the idea that some things are not for sale, is the kind of thing that makes a banker proud to have been in the room. But the real answer to the magnate's call did not come from any of them. It came from the institution itself, and it came at scale, and it came so fast that when the magnate finally walked out to his car at 11:30, full of his own cleverness, the ground he thought he was standing on had already moved beneath him, and he did not yet know it. I relieved Varen first. That was the order I cared most about. I brought up a steady young guardsman from the second relief, walked him to the third pillar myself, and stood the post change the way it is done, quiet, exact. The rifle of the relief coming to the order as the rifle of the relieved came down. No gap in the wall, never a gap in the wall. Then I walked Sergeant Varen off the floor through the household door, and the moment we were in the cool of the stone passage where no guest could see, I stopped, and I faced him, and I did a thing that is not in any drill. I came to attention, and I saluted him. He blinked the only time all night I saw him surprised. "Sir," he said, "that's not." "It is tonight," I told him. "You held the line with your hands when you were entitled to hold it with your voice. You gave that man nothing to use against this house and everything to be ashamed of. That's the finest thing I've watched a guardsman do in a long time, Sergeant, and the only reason I'm not saying so on the floor is that you'd hate it." I lowered the salute. "Go and sit. There's tea in the guard room. You're done for the night, and you've nothing to answer for, and if anyone tells you different, they'll be telling it to me first." He stood a moment, and then the steadiness cracked just slightly, not into emotion. Men like Varen do not do that on duty, but into something honest. "I kept thinking about the boys," he said quietly. "My sons. If they grow up and someone asks them what their father did, I didn't want the answer to be that he handed his rifle to a rich man for a laugh." He squared his cap. "That's all it was, sir. I just couldn't let that be the answer." "It won't be," I said. "I promise you that." I went back to the floor to keep it, and the controller's quiet machine kept turning. And over the next 2 hours I watched, piece by piece, the magnate's leverage come apart in his hands. The first piece was the morning papers he had promised. They never came. Not because anyone leaned on a single editor. The House does not work that way, and the controller would have considered it beneath the dignity of the thing. But because by midnight there were 50 first-hand witnesses, several of them more prominent than the magnate himself, ready to say on the record that they had watched a guest grab at a serving guardsman's rifle, and the guardsman decline with perfect restraint to be made a fool of. There is no story in that for the magnate. The only story is the one he would least like told, which is the true one. His fixer, who was good at his job, understood this within the hour and quietly killed the statement before it could be born. You cannot run a tale of a brutish soldier when the room is full of bankers who will laugh at you for trying. The second piece was the 2 ministers he had dined with. I do not know precisely what was said in the calls that crossed the city that night. I am a guardsman, not a courtier, and the high politics of it were above my pillar. But I know the shape of the result because I saw it land. Somewhere in the small hours, the magnate received a return call he had not been expecting, and whatever was in it took the last of the certainty out of him. The realm's quiet establishment, it transpired, did not relish the idea of a foreign-built fortune publicly threatening to switch off the country's credit because a soldier would not pose for a photograph. The ministers he had thought were his friends discovered, in the cool light of consideration, that their friendships had limits, and that those limits lay exactly at the point where a man asks them to take the side of arrogance against an institution the whole realm is fond of. They did not threaten him. They simply, gently, were unavailable, which to a man who has bought access his whole life is its own kind of avalanche. The third piece was the money, the tranche of the houses financing the magnate had promised to freeze, the lever he was surest of, the one he had built half his power on the certainty of. I will tell you what happened to it, because it is the cleanest illustration I know of what the word institution actually means. The magnate did not own that financing alone. No one fortune, however vast, lends a realm its operating credit. It is a syndicate, a long table of houses, each holding a piece, and the magnate's piece, large as it was a piece. And the other houses at that table had had people in the hall. The banker who had spoken up, he reached for the gun first, ran one of them. By 2 in the morning, word had moved among the lending houses the way word moves among people who have spent their lives reading rooms, and the word was simple. The magnate is about to do something that makes him look small and makes us look complicit, and we will not be complicit. By the time the magnate's instruction to pause the house's credit reached his own people, it had been quietly overtaken. The other houses had let it be known they would cover the gap. Not as a favor to the crown, as a matter of their own dignity. A man who pulls his money to punish a soldier is a man you do not want to be standing next to, and money, whatever else is said of it, is exquisitely sensitive to where it is safe to stand. So the magnate's one call, his great lever, his certainty about how the world really works, was answered not by a threat and not by a brawl, but by an entire structure of people and oaths and quiet self-respect closing ranks so smoothly that he never even saw it happen. He had reached for a rifle. The rifle had not moved, and neither, it turned out, had anything the rifle stood for. He came to find me before he left. I think he expected, even then, to leave with the last word. He had collected himself, straightened the gray suit, smoothed the sneer back into something he probably believed was dignity. And he crossed the thinning hall to where I stood near the third pillar, the relief guardsman still and scarlet beside me. "You'll regret this," he said low so the relief would not hear. "All of you, you've made an enemy tonight over a piece of theater." I looked at him for a moment. I am not, by training or by temperament, a man who lets the heat out, and I did not let it out then. But I had earned, I felt, the right to one true sentence, and I gave it to him level and quiet. "Sir," I said, "you didn't make an enemy tonight. You met a wall and you found out it was load-bearing. That's not the same thing, though I understand it can feel like it from where you're standing. I let that sit. The car's at the north door, every courtesy." He did not answer. There was, by then, nothing for him to answer with. He turned and walked the length of the hall of the long table, past the bankers who had watched him reach and watched him fail, past the pillars of scarlet that had not moved for him and would not, past 200 years of worn marble that had carried steadier men than he would ever be, and he went out into the river fog, and the north door closed behind him, and that was the last any of us saw of the magnate inside the walls of Calder House. He did not switch off the realm's lights. He was never in a position to, though he had believed it of himself for so long that the belief had become the truest thing about him. Within a week the syndicate had quietly rebalanced. The house's credit rolled over on the appointed morning without a question mark beside it, covered 3 times over by houses that had decided they would rather be the kind of lender that stands with an institution than the kind that flinches when a soldier won't pose for a photograph. The magnate's piece of that table grew smaller after that, not because anyone punished him, but because money, having watched him in that hall, drew its own conclusions and moved its own way. The morning papers carried nothing. The ministers found their calendars full. The whole great lever he had reached for came back to him weightless in his hand, and a man who has spent his life sure of his own gravity does not, I think, recover quickly from the discovery that the room was holding him up all along and has now, gently, set him down. That is the part of the night I'd want a younger officer to understand if I could only give him one part of it. The magnate thought the contest was between his power and our rule, and that power, being the heavier thing, would win. But it was never a contest of power. Varon did not win by being stronger than the magnate. One sergeant could not outmoney a man who owns ports, and he never tried. He won by being immovable on a single small thing. This rifle does not leave my hands, and by trusting, through 6 years on a marble floor in one terrible reaching instant, that if he held that one small thing, everything behind it would hold him. And it did. The controller held him, and the witnesses held him, and the head of the house held him, and the long table of houses he had never met held him, and an oath 2 centuries old held him, all of it closing ranks around one man's refusal to make his uniform a joke. The wall was load-bearing. He had only to be the part of it that did not give. We never made a fuss of it. That, too, is the house's way. There was no medal, no ceremony, no notice on the board. Sergeant Varon had his tea that night, and was back at the 3rd pillar 2 evenings later, scarlet and immaculate, eyes 1,000 yards forward through the chandeliers, the rifle at the order against his right side exactly as it had been since the first night he marched on. If you had walked the hall of the long table the following Founder's Eve, you would have seen nothing but a row of still men in tall black caps, and you would have thought, as the magnate thought, that they were the easiest thing in the world to overlook. I hope, in a way, that you would think that. The day people stop overlooking them is the day something has gone wrong. The whole point of the wall is that it asks for nothing, says nothing, and gives nothing away. That it stands so quietly you forget it is the reason the room is safe to be careless in. The magnate forgot. Most people forget. It is, when you think about it, the finest compliment the rest of us can pay them. That we are free to laugh and drink and reach for things, all evening, under 3 crystal trees of light, precisely because there are men along the river wall who will not, under any pressure money can bring to bear, hand over the one thing they are sworn to hold. I have stood a great many posts in my life, and given a great many orders, and I have learned that the measure of a guardsman is not how he carries himself when the hall is admiring him. It is what he does in the 1 second when a powerful hand reaches for the thing he swore to keep, and the whole easy world expects him to let it go. Varon did not let it go, and the house, when it mattered, did not let him. That is the weapon he would not lend, and the wall that would not let him stand alone.